Good evening, and welcome to the Journey Home. It's a great privilege to be with you tonight, and I am a little nervous tonight because I have a very special guest tonight on our program, and we've had very special converts on the program before. Tom Howard, Scott Hahn. We've had Father Graham Leonard, the former Bishop of England, but tonight we have Cardinal Avery Dulles, and it's a great privilege to have you here, Your Eminence. Some of you may know Cardinal Dulles is the son of the U.S. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, and I didn't know him. I didn't know very much of him. I guess a little bit before my time, but knew so much about what he did. And of course, we recognize that name every time we fly into Washington, D.C., so your family has been greatly recognized. But Cardinal Dulles was the first U.S.-born theologian to be raised to the chair, the College of Cardinals. So it's great to have you here. I want to remind you that you're an important part of tonight's program. The phone number is 1-800-221-9460. Or if you're outside North America, you can give us a call at 205-271-2980. And let me take just a moment here at the beginning of the program to remind you that our March for Life coverage begins in a week, Wednesday, January 21st, with the Mass for Life. And then join us Thursday for the March for Life starting at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Be praying for this coverage and all that will be coming up next week. A lot of people will be traveling a long ways to take a stand for the Church's view on life. And so pray for our coverage as well as those who will be involved. And so let me greet you, Your Eminence. It is a great privilege to have you here.
And be with you, Marcus.
I gave a very inadequate introduction because the articles and the books you've written, the great influence you've had on so many. I mentioned to you before the program, I joked that I'd been to the Bishops' Conference 3 times over the last couple of years, and whenever the bishops need a theological definition, they call on Cardinal Dulles to come forward. And I think that bespeaks of who you are and what you have to say. And another thing I want to say is that when I converted to the Church, one of the continuing things that I saw, that I knew this was the Church, was when I saw leaders in the Church unafraid to talk about Jesus. That wasn't always the case from where I came from. And it's just a wonderful privilege to have you here with us. I'd like to begin, as I usually do, and invite you to give us your spiritual background before your conversion to the Church.
Well, I come from a family that had strong Presbyterian roots. One of my great-grandfathers was a missionary to India. My grandfather was a Presbyterian minister in various parts of the country, ending up in Auburn, New York, where I was born. And his wife was my grandmother, were very much involved in church work throughout her life. And some people hoped that my father would choose a ministerial career, but he was influenced by his grandfather and decided rather on law and diplomacy as his field. But he always had a strong religious interest himself. And as a child, we used to go regularly to the Presbyterian Church in New York City. My father leading the procession with his top hat and cane, which people used to wear in those days, and tails even, I think. But during the 30s, somehow that tapered off a bit, and we got a house out in the country where we used to go out for weekends, and we didn't seem to practice that Sunday observance so much. And so although I was somewhat familiar with religious topics and with the Bible as a child, when I got into boarding schools and so forth, I tended to pay less attention to that, and the church services that we went to were rather non-denominational. I would almost say nondescript. And no, there wasn't any very vigorous teaching of any particular Christian doctrine or faith. It was more general wisdom about life, which I didn't mind, of course, but it wasn't a kind of thing that would grip you. So in my classes, it seemed to me everything was explained in terms of this worldly elements, and So I began to think religion was really quite irrelevant to life, so it ceased to interest me very much.
During your high school years, you spent some time overseas, is that right?
I spent 2 years in Switzerland. I think the high point of that was an Easter vacation that I spent in Italy. And that tour of Italy provided me with all sorts of materials which I later drew on when I was moving toward the church, because we visited all these beautiful churches and saw all this religious art. And got a great respect for the culture of the Italian Renaissance and even the late Middle Ages, which I retained throughout my life. But then I came back and went to school in New England for 4 years before I went off to college.
Yeah. Did your time visiting those cathedrals have an influence on your faith during your period overseas? Immediately? Or?
Well, not. Perhaps there was a certain attraction there rather than a direct religious influence at the time. I began to see the beauty of the ceremonies, and I remember being in Rome during Holy Week, even Palm Sunday, and seeing the palms and so forth. And we didn't have anything like that in our Presbyterian church.
For sure.
As a young kid, I was quite taken by these ceremonies. And we went into St. Peter's, and there was a great ceremony going on I think it may have been Holy Thursday or something, and those were very impressive. Yeah.
You chose to go to Harvard, right, for your undergraduate degree.
I did.
Let me ask you before we talk about that experience, because that seemed to be a key one for your own spiritual growth. When you entered Harvard, by that time, I think you described that you had completely bought into materialism.
I think I had. I wouldn't say that I had a consistent philosophy of life exactly. That would be too much to expect, I guess, at the age of 16 or 17. But I think that certainly was dominant in my mind, that I thought everything could be explained in terms of matter. I don't know how you would explain matter itself. It was just sort of there, didn't need to be explained. And somehow or other, the atoms spinning around coagulated in certain ways and produced big things like the sun and the earth spinning off from it, sort of and somehow by accident, it just so happened that the molecules got so connected together that life arose, and then life had a sort of a dynamism, a tendency to move upward and get more complex, and so you had this whole process of evolution, which could probably be explained in more or less Darwinian terms of things, selection and mutations and natural selection and so forth. Whatever the mechanisms were, I didn't really know, but I thought it could be explained from below without appealing to any divine agent. So I thought it was more or less superfluous to invoke divine causality at any point in the process. And as far as morality was concerned, I didn't really see there was any objective moral law that required you to do this, that, or the other thing. I didn't know where that would come from. So I tended to think morality is just a social convention of what society decides is for its own long-term interests, and tries to persuade people to do things that are socially beneficial rather than what is right or wrong in itself.
It's kind of sadly the way a lot of our young people head off towards college with that kind of view of freedom. It's very convenient to have that kind of view of freedom when you're leaving family and going off to college. So, but you're basically saying that God didn't fit into the equation, at least on an everyday thinking for you.
Yeah. I didn't have any metaphysics or way of arriving at the existence of God, so I just thought that could be omitted from the equation, as you say.
So you went to Harvard, and you know, at one time Harvard was established to provide ministers for the ministry in New England. But I don't often think of Harvard as a place to, nowadays, to experience a great spiritual renewal. But that had a big place in your own life. So
it did. I studied under professors, mainly philosophy and history from medieval Europe and did certain Renaissance studies and so forth, who had a great interest in the history of theology, and so had to study the controversies, theological controversies during the Reformation, for example, and really become somewhat familiar with the writings of Thomas Aquinas and Dante and Augustine and so forth. So many of these things were assigned for courses that I was taking, and the professors thought that should be taken seriously. They weren't Catholics for the most part. One or two of them might be Catholic, but most of them were Presbyterian, Protestants of some kind or other. But they at least thought that religion was a respectable subject to study and had been very important in history and for culture and so forth. So I picked up a lot of theology without taking any courses that were called theology courses, just in the reading that I was forced to do for my own work. And so I think that academic experience was the main one, both philosophy and history of culture. But also the environment of Cambridge, Massachusetts was thoroughly Catholic at that time. You know, the popular religion was very strong. You know, if you went into a Catholic church, it was full, even on weekdays and so forth. So the atmosphere of Catholicism was very present there as a living religion. And so it was somewhat...
Which is interesting when you know the history of New England, that Catholicism had established such a strong front there along the Charles River, and it became so significant, I'm sure, because of the immigrants.
There was a certain town and gown rivalry. The town was very Catholic, and the gown was very, well, not exactly anti-Catholic, but certainly non-Catholic.
Right. Right. Well, so was there any time in, so you really through history and philosophy then, is what awakened your heart to at least be open to the possibility of God in the Christian faith?
And I had a personal quest also. I just didn't think that hedonism or utilitarianism quite added up. They didn't satisfy the needs of the human spirit. I needed something more than that, you know, something that would warrant heroism or sacrifice or generosity, and that just wasn't to be found in these systems, and I felt that they were very inadequate to the human spirit. And I found something else in my historical studies which did seem to speak to the human spirit, and even in the philosophy, somebody like Plato meant a great deal to me. His insistence that you did more harm to yourself by doing evil than by suffering evil. It's better to suffer than to perform evil. You corrupt yourself in doing what is against the virtues that are belong, and so it's more important to be good than to be happy for Plato. I thought he was right on that. I still think he was right.
That's right.
But the motivation for virtue really isn't quite given in Plato, and there's where I turned to the New Testament. I said, you find it in the teaching of Jesus, you find it in Paul, you find it in John, you find it throughout the New Testament. The things that Plato seemed to be looking for are clearly stated, you know, the whole doctrine of the afterlife and punishments and rewards and so forth, the personal God who is behind the whole moral system. That made it make sense to me. So I said, you know, Christianity has something that Greek philosophy was looking for and didn't quite find. They needed a revelation from God.
Through your history, your philosophy, and which is, I find interesting, is that even though your professors were not so much promoting a practical faith, but they were open to the reality of it in history and philosophy and taking it seriously. And of course, you were on your own search. I'm wondering, during those years in college, did you have a support system? Did you have other students who were also on this quest, or were you on this all by yourself?
I was pretty much a solitary quest, you know. My friends were all religiously indifferent, it seemed to me, or maybe silent, I don't know. Some did go to church on Sunday, but they didn't talk much about it. So I didn't have none of my close friends was Catholic. I had one professor was quite vocal about his Catholicism, but I only had contact with him for 1 year, and then he went off to teach at Georgetown and left to Harvard. So I was kind of looking by myself, reading my way into the church. I found a Catholic bookstore. I used to borrow books and would come home every weekend with my an armful of books, you know, and it was minimal charges for a lending library. Bring them back in the next week and get some more books. So I really read my way into the church, but and then occasionally attended church service.
I was wondering, you didn't immediately go into the Catholic Church? Did it first draw you back into your heritage?
Well, I first went mainly to Protestant churches around Cambridge, and I didn't quite find what I was looking for. I think Protestantism, at least in New England at that time, was at a fairly low level, and it tended to be more ethical culture than any particular doctrine, you know. And so I just didn't find any very firm doctrinal preaching. I found a lack of dogma there. Whereas in the Catholic Church, I found it very complex and baffling, but at the same time, I did find that certain revealed truths in the creed and so forth were beyond question true, and they were working from that rather than toward them. So it appealed to me very much. I want to mention one experience. I went on it happened to be a Sunday evening into a Catholic church. It was full of people, and they were all singing. And they were singing the hymns of Thomas Aquinas in Latin. I sort of felt that's the church for me. I'm sort of an amateur medievalist.
Well, so you had a good background in Latin.
I had a good background in Latin. I could read it easily. So.
You certainly came into the church then in 1940, right?
Yes, 1940. I was a first-year law student actually when I came into the church, but I pretty much made up my mind by the time I graduated from college.
You were a bit of a loner on this quest in college. Was your family with you on this?
No, they knew. I thought they knew what I was reading and so forth and so on. When I was home during the summer, and they might get the idea that I was serious about some of these things. But when I wrote to them in the fall of 1940 that I was going to come into the church the next month, they seemed to be quite shocked and surprised by that. That was not the kind of thing that was done, especially in our family, I guess.
Well, your father was still in a very influential position at that period, right?
Actually, during the 1930s, he wasn't very active in his pursuit of religion and his practice. But then after 1937, he began to come back to the church and see its importance for the kind of work that he was doing in international relations and things. So he was, by that time, working for the National Council of Churches of Christ and working on the foundations of what was later to become the World Council of Churches.
Oh, he was very much involved in that then?
He was involved in that too, yes.
All right. But he was accepting or not very keen about your decision?
Yeah, I think he called me down, or at least my mother asked me to come down to talk with him. So I did. I came down. We had a nice discussion for a couple of hours. At the end of it, he said, well, I was just 22 by that time, so he said, you're of age, you can make your own decisions. You think it's the wrong decision, but if this is a decision you want to make, we can't prevent it. And so we kind of agreed to disagree, maybe. So I just went on my own way.
So you became Catholic there in the same year you began law school, and it's one thing for your family to accept that fact, but you ended up with even a deeper decision, which I wonder how the rest of your family. Now, this was a number of years later, right, that you felt the call to the priesthood?
Well, no, actually, at the time I came into the church, I asked the priest who was instructing me, how do I get into the Jesuits?
Oh, right away?
Yeah, right away. I just
now, what had made you think of the Jesuits right off the bat?
Well, because partly by reading in history, I'd read about the foundation of the Jesuits, the early Jesuits in the 16th century and what they'd done, and I felt I wanted to belong to an apostolic order that was mobile and evangelizing, and so it seemed to me that was their kind of work, and I thought I could fit into that, more or less intellectual apostolate, which I had some inclination toward. So it appealed to me more than the parish ministry and more than the contemplative religious orders. I suppose I could have worked in some other active religious order if I hadn't been accepted by the Jesuits, but I liked their long tradition, and I liked what I knew of St. Ignatius and his companions of the 16th century. A great admiration for them, wanted to be rooted in that tradition. So I asked about it when I came into the church, but there was a rule, I think it's still a rule, that you had to be in the church at least 3 years before you were accepted as a novitiate. So I was told to forget about it for 3 years. Well, then the war came along, so it was about 6 years before I was
Unique
able to enter.
novitiate, the war.
Yeah, so I did enter, but by that time I think the family had given up on me totally, so I couldn't do anything that they would not accept.
Well, you've been, let's see, that was 1946, so you've been in the Jesuits for 55, 56 years.
Yeah.
You've seen the Jesuits go through a lot in
I have.
55, 56
I've
years.
never wanted to be anywhere else.
But did you expect that one day you would have the great privilege of being a cardinal?
That I did not expect. That was such a rarity among Jesuits, and the only Jesuits who become cardinals, practically speaking, are those who are in missionary countries who are bishops or archbishops or something. So I certainly didn't expect that to happen, but yeah. So if it did, why?
Well, I'm curious, being one that will never become a cardinal, what's unique about your life now that you're a cardinal? There's unique aspects that come to you because you're a cardinal.
Really very little, because if I were under 80 years old, there would be quite a lot. I would have many duties for religious congregations and things in Rome, but I'm not eligible to be a member of any of those papal congregations, being over 80, and I'm not a bishop, and so I do very little as a cardinal. You know, occasionally for solemn masses and things, I have to appear in all my vestments, or occasionally liturgical events, but by and large, I don't have any particular duties. You mentioned the Bishops' Conference. I am a member of the Bishops' Conference, kind of an honorary member because I'm not a bishop,
But every time I've been there, you've always had important words to say, especially when they find themselves a few on different sides of an issue, and it's good to have. Before we take a break, Your Eminence, I did want to mention a new book. Is this a a reissue of it?
It's a reissue of a book that came out in 1946, and I wrote it in 1944, literally at sea.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, this is called Testimony to Grace and Reflections on a Theological Journey. Is it a description of your journey into the church?
Yes, it is, yeah. It's sort of my intellectual autobiography up to that time, really.
All right, well, I think those of you who are watching will see it listed on the television if you're interested in more details about Cardinal Dulles' journey. So thank you very much. Let's take a break, and we'll be back just a moment with your questions for Cardinal Avery Dulles. Welcome back. Tonight's guest is Cardinal Avery Dulles, and again, it's a wonderful privilege to have you here. And we already have a number of emails and phone calls awaiting, and we even have an excited audience out here. Too bad we don't have a microphone to get some of your questions out here in the audience. But let's take our first email, Your Eminence. This comes from Gary in Tampa, Florida, and he asked, "Dear Cardinal Dulles, will you tell us how the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius affected your conversion to the Catholic faith? Specifically, can you give some insight regarding the 3 degrees of humility, and what sacred scripture passages can you recommend that may lead to a fruitful prayer regarding humility?" So, first of all, the spiritual exercises, what part did they play in your own journey?
I think a minimal part. I was aware that there were spiritual exercises. In fact, I think that we probably had to look them over at least. It's not a book to be read, it's a book to be done. You know, we didn't do the spiritual exercises. I was more or less familiar with the book and the autobiography of St. Ignatius we had to read, I do remember. But I don't think that in itself had a great impact on my conversion. I think the study of the theological controversies of the Reformation period did influence me, and I felt where Catholics, whether Calvin and Luther differed from Catholicism, my sympathies tended to be with the Catholic position as taken at, say, at the Council of Trent, where we had a number of Jesuit theologians working, but St. Ignatius himself was not really a theologian in the technical sense of the word. The Spiritual Exercise is obviously a great book. It's meant a great deal to me as a Jesuit. I think really the centrality of Jesus is the most central thing, that it is the Society of Jesus, and Ignatius insisted that would be its name. So it's the following of Jesus, and the meditation on 3 degrees of humility is one of those exercises in which one sort of tests oneself as to whether one would be willing to follow Jesus, not only in not disobeying the law of God, but even in giving oneself to prefer to be with him in his sufferings than not to be, because that unites us more closely to the Lord if we share in his sufferings as well as in his joys, which are the reward of them. So I think there are many, many passages in Scripture that tend in that direction, but I think the idea that all Christians are following Christ and have to take a share in the cross, and Jesus himself said
this issue of suffering, which did you, in your journey to the faith, did you, during that period, discover the uniqueness of the Catholic view of suffering versus, let's say, your Presbyterian background?
I don't really know. I was more concerned with doctrines than with spirituality at that time, I think.
Yeah.
So I accepted the Catholic view on suffering and the value that suffering can have if it's united to the suffering of Christ the Redeemer. But that wasn't really an issue for me.
Yeah, because it really doesn't come up much in our Presbyterian backgrounds, this issue of suffering. But it's such a key part, especially of Ignatius's theology and the whole foundation. In fact, it makes me wonder, you were brought up in New England, and I went to seminary in New England, and what amazed me later when I became a Catholic was how I could go through all those years in New England. I could learn about Protestant missionaries to the Indians, but I never heard about those wonderful Jesuits up in Canada. Isaac Jogues and de Brebeuf and
or the missionaries, the Jesuit missionaries to India did a few things too, including St. Francis Xavier.
I never even heard about them when I was in that, going through my own seminary training. Let's take our first caller. This is Raphael from Kansas. Hello, Raphael. What's your question for us?
Oh, hello?
Yes, hello.
Yeah, good evening, Marcus. Love your show.
Thank you.
Yeah, good evening, Your Eminence. I just have a quick question. I'd like your comment on the recent pastoral letter written by Bishop Burke on the dignity of human life and civic responsibility. I know he's has been criticized a lot by some theologian, most recently by Dan McGuire from Marquette University, as being theologically off base. Just like your comment on that real quick.
Well, I really don't know the document you're talking about very well. I do know there's been some mention of him in the press that he does want to take a more aggressive attitude in holding Catholics to Catholic politicians, to making them accountable for taking the positions of the Church, particularly with regard to these life questions, such as the issue of abortion, which will be discussed in that March for Life next week. So I applaud that. I think that it's scandalous to allow Catholic politicians to claim to be Catholic and at the same time to be contradicting the doctrine of the Church by admitting that they are pro-choice or even pro-abortion.
Politicians are, to be a Catholic politician in our country is difficult, because
Tough,
how do you get
very
elected?
tough. Yeah, very tough.
And if you can't get elected, you can't help. So
Yeah.
it's a real...
There are a few who are getting elected, and I don't know how they do it, but they
It's-
manage to get elected
it's
anyway
difficult.
for taking consistent Catholic positions. But
Well, the key is we
Yeah.
need Catholic voters
Yeah.
who will vote,
Yeah.
get out and support these men so they can have an influence.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they can't have an influence. And so it is difficult. Let's take our next email. This comes from Robert in Dayton, Ohio. Cardinal Dulles, what an honor to listen to your conversion story. You are one of the spiritual giants in our church. May God continue to bless you. You talk for a moment on your vision for the Catholic Church in the third millennium. What changes, if any, do you foresee? What are your thoughts on Protestant Catholic discussions? And I'll repeat all these. And do you anticipate the Orthodox Church submitting to the authority of the papacy? To Jesus through Mary with Peter Robert. So first, your thoughts
Yeah.
on the third millennia and changes.
I think stay the course is what I think we need. I think there's been too much talk of changes, and I don't know. I guess I'm getting more conservative in my old age, but I think anybody who's a loyal Catholic finds a great deal in the tradition that they want to conserve, and I'm afraid what we've been failing to do is to, what should we say, to mine the tradition for its wealth. I think there's so much there when I read the Church Fathers and the medieval doctors and the Renaissance, Reformation theologians and so forth. I don't think we need to start up on some new course. I think we just simply need to reiterate the truth and to understand it, to appropriate it, and to appropriate this whole tradition. I hope that we get less excited about trying to do something new that's never been done before, and we ought to do what we've always been doing that's right, and to appreciate it, to make it known. With Catholic-Protestant relations, I think we're finding more and more in common, which is a good thing. But we also have to discuss our differences, quite frankly, I think, and to challenge one another a little bit. And I think Protestants have a lot to give Catholics, and Catholics have a lot to give Protestants, and we shouldn't be shy about those things that are distinctive to our own traditions. We should try to sell them, as it were, to each other. And I think one of the great assets that the Catholic Church has ecumenically is the office of Peter, the Petrine office, which was established by our Lord with the idea of holding the flock of Christ together. And I don't think there's any substitute for it. So I think Protestants are looking for a way in which they can overcome their mutual differences and the lack of discipline and conformity in their own churches. And perhaps the Orthodox also. I think they have a lot of trouble with the autocephalous churches of the Balkans and so forth, all going their own way and not abiding by the authority of the patriarch, who has only a primacy of honor. I think you need more than a primacy of honor to hold the Church of Christ together. And perhaps they will come to appreciate the need for a primacy that has some power as well as some honor.
Let me ask you just to clarify, to make sure that we're hearing you correctly, and that is that on the one hand, we certainly are called by Christ in charity to our ecumenism, but ecumenism does not mean a watering down of the need to call for unity under our Holy Father, right?
I think ecumenism precisely is the quest for unity among Christian churches. And as defined by many authorities, it's the quest for visible unity. They want to have some a visible manifestation of the unity of Christians. And that, of course, is a matter of degree. We have some degree of unity already, at least among those that baptize, those that read the same Gospels, those that worship the same Lord, that say the Our Father together. There are many, many things that we do have in common already, but it's a matter of increasing our common elements and sharing more and more.
And things like the March for Life are a visible expression of at least one area that we stand side by side.
That shouldn't be an exclusively Catholic thing. It is not.
Right. And it demonstrates there's a unity that's there in our baptism as we stand together.
Yes.
Let's take our next caller. This is Lawrence from Arizona. Hello, Lawrence. What's your question?
Hi. Good evening, Your Eminence. We are proud and honored to have you in our church as a cardinal. You've done many wonderful things. I have 3 or 4 questions. You mentioned one previously, shortly, the reaction of your parents to your conversion, and then the reaction of your parents and family to your priesthood, and then was your mother also Presbyterian? And there is a Dulles family in San Antonio. Is that some of your siblings?
Yes. The answer, I guess, to all the questions is yes. I mentioned more my father, who was sort of the head of the family, but my mother was also Presbyterian. She was more reticent about her faith. I was never really very, very clear about how much she believed, but she certainly was a practicing Presbyterian. And I do have a brother who lives in San Antonio with his wife and some of his children.
You mentioned earlier when we talked that when you became a Catholic or in the journey, that your grandmother was still alive.
Yeah.
You know, the missionaries, the pastor's wife.
Yeah.
And her response to your decision.
Yes, she was quite old and sick at the time. She was confined to bed and almost blind, and it was evident that she wasn't going to live much longer. So my parents asked me if I wouldn't delay my conversion and my interest in the Catholic Church until after my grandmother had died, which couldn't be more than a year or two. And so I said, no, I have the grace to do it now. I've got to live up to the grace while I have it, you know, and I don't know what graces will be given 2 or 3 years from now. So I said, well, I'll write her a letter. So I wrote her a letter explaining what I was doing and why. I got the nicest letter back. She said, oh, she was so happy that I had found a strong Christian faith, and she had been brought up. Her father had been minister to Spain at one time, which was the equivalent of ambassador in those days. And she had gotten to know the churches in Spain and some ecclesiastics and so forth, and admired them so much. And now she had a Catholic nurse who was reading reading prayers to her at her bedside every night. She asked me to recommend another prayer book for her and so forth. So we had very nice correspondence for the next few months, and I even saw her once before she died. She was really very delighted that I was becoming a Catholic.
The most supportive person in your family, really.
The most, yes. Yeah.
All right, let's take our next email. This comes from Kristen. She writes, God blessings. I am a student at Lemoyne College in Syracuse, New York, a Jesuit institution. Cardinal Dulles, since joining the Jesuits, how would you say that your spiritual journey has been most impacted? How would you relate the spiritual journey in the spirit of St. Ignatius with the uncovering of one's own vocation, discovering of who we really are? Thank you. And know that the students of Lemoyne would love to have you visit with us anytime, as you did 3 years ago.
Good.
How was your spiritual journey most impacted since joining the Jesuits? And she was talking about relating the spiritual journey in the spirit of St. Ignatius, the uncovering of one's own vocation.
Yeah. Well, I did mention the spiritual exercises several times, and but I don't think it's only the spiritual exercises. A lot of the spirituality of St. Ignatius comes up in the constitutions of the Society of Jesus, and in his personal correspondence, which is extremely rich in giving spiritual advice to people to whom he was writing and who were writing to him. So he really was a remarkable man. Did very surprising things. Sometimes he'd do exactly the opposite of what you would expect, and but he was a real spiritual genius, I think, as a spiritual guide. He was a really extraordinary man, and he founded a religious order that was quite unlike anything that had existed before. It was so mobile that it could go to any part of the world, always at the behest of the Pope. He saw the Pope as the person in charge of the whole of the church, and who could see where the need was greater and tell the Jesuits, go to this, do this, and so forth. So he wanted to make himself a kind of a society completely dedicated to the apostolate, the service of the Pope. I think that was a wonderful idea, and it's so much needed in the world today. I really feel that there are urgent needs that are not being met, and there's a terrible lack of Catholic education in this country and elsewhere, and there's large defections going on, people going over. Yeah.
But I wanted to ask you that, because earlier you had mentioned that as you look to this third millennium that hold the course, but there's an awful lot of us that, well, we don't like some of the things that are on the course, and what do you do? And so on the one hand, I agree that to me one of the virtues we lost in the 20th century is the virtue of patience.
Yeah.
And so yes, there's a side of that. But on the other hand, well, what about the areas that do need change, like areas of poor formation? I mean, any thoughts on that as we look to this century?
Yeah, precisely. I think it's the recent changes that are the source of most of the trouble. People are constantly reforming things for the worse, and all kinds of reforms in catechetical training and liturgical worship and things that have gone on since the Second Vatican Council have really been changes for the worse, and there is not the same degree of prayerfulness and contact with the Lord, it seems to me, that we had in pre-Vatican II worship. Now there are some advantages in having the liturgy in the vernacular. I'm certainly not against that. But at the same time, the thing has been somewhat debased, and the Catholic catechetical training has been so psychologized that we've lost the substance, and people come after 4 or 8 years of education to college, don't know a thing about their creed any longer. It's just amazing how they could have done that in 8 years of Catholic schooling. But so we need to get back to the best things in the tradition. That's what I really meant. Yeah.
All right, very good. Thank you. Let's take our next caller, Michael from Virginia. Hello, Michael. What's your question?
Hi, Your Eminence. My name is Michael Browning from West Virginia, and I was raised I'm 44 years old, and I was raised in the Lutheran faith, and I've met some wonderful Catholics here, and I attend the St. John's University Parish in Morgantown, West Virginia, and I'm learning about Catholicism. I really love the Eucharist and the power of the Eucharist that is really helping my faith. And my question has to do with the doctrine of purgatory, I guess you would say, and because I don't know much about it, I'd like to know perhaps a recommendation of a book to read to learn about purgatory, and also to learn about the importance of what Bible that I could read like the Septuagint. My Greek studies have really helped me to understand the Bible better. And is the Septuagint a good study to get deeper into the Bible study?
Thank you, Michael. Okay. So a book about purgatory.
I don't know. I can't think of a book on purgatory at the moment. That's
per se on it.
Per se, it certainly is treated in any catechism and so forth. So there's some treatment of purgatory in the present catechism, and that might give you some clues, some references in the footnotes to other documents of the Church on purgatory. I've always found purgatory one of the easiest doctrines to believe. It just seems to me it makes perfect sense that people who are not so bad that they deserve to be sent to hell are not yet quite prepared for the beatific vision. They have too many spots on their soul from previous sins and so forth, that they haven't quite eradicated the effects. They need a little purification, and maybe even a painful purification, in order to enter into the vision of God. And there are passages in Scripture that seem to refer to something like that, and Paul in 1 Corinthians speaks about some of the hay will have to be burned away. I forget just how that is. And,
I live out in the country, and you know, you need a mud room, right?
Yeah.
Where you can take off your
Yeah.
muddy boots
Yeah.
and take off your other things so you can enter into the house.
Yeah.
Well, that's what purgatory is. It's that entryway before we enter into the beatific vision of God. I mean,
So the
His other-
Septuagint is the Greek Bible that was in use in the early church, especially the Greek-speaking church in the early centuries, and really is the basis for the most part for the Vulgate translation of, well, the Vulgate went back to the pre-Vulgate translations, I should say. The Vetus Latina was based on the Vulgate, and Jerome tended to go more to the Hebrew texts when he did his Vulgate version. But there was a theory among many of the church fathers that the Septuagint was inspired. So I don't think many people hold that today, but at least it was the Bible of the early church. And
well, one thing we've pointed out many times
yeah.
on the program is that a lot of the New Testament quotes of the Old Testament are clearly from the Septuagint.
Yeah.
And that, in some ways, is a foundation for believing that
Yeah.
the early church, they used the Septuagint even the time of Jesus.
Well, some passages that are in the Catholic Bible appear only in the Septuagint and don't appear in the Hebrew texts that we have survived anyway. So some of it was actually written in Greek, some of the Catholic Bible. So on those passages, we have to depend on the Septuagint, or Septuagint, as some pronounce it. So it is it's an important thing in the Catholic tradition, but the recent translations have preferred to use the Hebrew texts where we have reliable Hebrew
You know,
texts.
I'm kind of with this gentleman that called, because I studied Greek in college, in seminary.
Yeah.
And I love studying their New Testament in Greek, and I was sad to see that as Catholics, so often Greek wasn't a main part of seminary training for our priests. I wish they had, you know, there was Latin, but not the Greek, to keep them in touch with the Greek New Testament. I kind of like, at the Josephinum, I know they're teaching it now, so it's good to see
we
that.
had to learn Greek, and when I went to Rome for my doctoral studies, I took courses in the Pontifical Biblical Institute there, and they used the Greek text exclusively to comment on. The lectures were in Latin.
So that about what you're saying is then really about the same time in the 60s when Latin was kind of dropped and set aside, so was the Greek. Really about the same time.
But, it's
coming back.
Yeah, it's coming back to some degree. At least some students are seeing the importance of learning Latin and Greek, because that's the only way we can get hold of our tradition. So you had so many doctoral students during this 60s, 70s, 80s who didn't know foreign languages and didn't know ancient languages, and so they began to write their dissertations on Protestant theologians who wrote in English or some language familiar to them, and a lot of the Latin tradition has been lost.
I hadn't thought about that angle as an influence to where we've gone in the last 40 years, is that shift in emphasis. When they don't know the languages, they end up going to Protestant theologians.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Let's take this next caller, Steve from Missouri. Hello.
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 Hi, Marcus. Love your show.
Thank you. What's your question?
Yes, Your Eminence. Do you think this touches a little bit on ecumenism that you talked about earlier? Do you think that dialoguing effort between Catholics and Anglicans are now hurt because of their recent ordination of an openly gay bishop?
Thank you.
I believe it has. I think some of the conversations have been suspended because I think the bishop who was heading up that dialogue was one of those who was favoring the ordination of the gay bishop. So So that has been an obstacle, but I think it's something we can recover from probably, but at least temporarily it's a setback in the dialogue. And
Do you think what do you think is going to happen? Are you going to see people coming back to the Catholic Church or a new denomination, do you think?
I don't know. It's interesting that at Lambeth, apparently, the other Anglican churches sort of said the United States Protestant Episcopal Church is out of line on this.
Yeah.
And so the dissident elements in the United States and Canada are probably going to find solidarity with European and African, Asiatic Anglican churches rather than go over to Rome, I suspect. But we'll see what happens.
Well, we're hoping. We're here waiting and ready, you know. So let's see if we can get one more email in. This comes from John Cardinal in Ensenada, California. Your Eminence, as a Fordham graduate, he graduated in 1958, I am interested in your activities with the students and your observations on this generation of Catholic college students.
I only teach seminars for doctoral students in theology, and they're fine, I must say. We have very fine students, and they're really interested in historical and theological questions, and they're a good selection. But for the student body in general, I really wouldn't be in a position to comment. I have the impression that they're open, but ignorant and somewhat uncommitted. So they have nothing against the church. They don't have any chip on their shoulder or anything like that. They're receptive, but they've never been told exactly what the church teaches and why. And I do think there's an urgent need for Catholic educational institutions, and I would include Fordham among others, to tell them what the Catholic Church teaches on very different questions that are urgent issues today, and what's the rationale for the Catholic doctrine, because they really haven't been taught. It isn't so much that they dissent, they just you know, sort of say, well, Judge, left to my own, this is what I would be inclined to think. Tell me why I'm wrong. They need to be told.
Your Eminence, first of all, let me thank you very much.
Well, thank you,
for
Marcus.
being on the program tonight. And just a couple things. I do want to remind the audience, those of you who have been listening to EWTN today, and some may not realize that Father Benedict Rochelle was in an accident this weekend. He was struck by a car, and he's in the hospital in critical condition. And so a number of times on the network today, we've had live broadcasts of the Rosary and prayer for Father Benedict. And so we particularly want to encourage all of you to keep him in prayer. He's an important part of EWTN, but he's also has a tremendous work right where you live. Cardinal, isn't that true there in the Bronx?
I see a lot of him in the New York area, in the Bronx, and at the seminary at Dunwoody, where both of us do some teaching. So I'm very, very sorry to hear about that, and I'll certainly be praying for him myself.
All right. So we want to encourage you at home to keep Father Benedict in prayer. And if I could, Cardinal, could I ask you to give us a blessing as we close tonight's program?
Right now?
Yes. If we
May the blessing of Almighty God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit descend upon you all and remain forever.
Thank you very much. Thank you again for joining us. And I want to encourage the audience again, your book, which is a 50th reprint, a 50-year reprint of A Testimony to Grace and Reflections on a Theological Journey. If you'd like to know more about the details of Cardinal Dulles' journey to the church, I want to thank you, as the audience has, for your work with the Church, Cardinal. And always a pleasure to have you here with EWTN. And for the rest of you, I thank you very much for joining us here in the Journey Home. I look forward to seeing you next week. I'll be here on Journey Home Monday night, but then I'll join you Wednesday and Thursday from Washington, D.C. And again, I ask for your prayers as we reflectively approach this year's March for Life. What are the ways that we can defend the Church's teachings where we live and in the parishes where we worship? God bless you, and I'll see you again next week.